Shadow Court, Medieval Justice and Punishment. Tonight, we're descending into the darkest corners of medieval justice, a world where punishment wasn't just about consequences, but about spectacle, suffering, and the absolute terror of public example. We're stripping away the sanitized Hollywood version of medieval crime and punishment to reveal the blood-soaked, bone-breaking reality that awaited those who dared cross the line in a world where mercy was a luxury few could afford. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy these unfiltered glimpses into history's most brutal chapters. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always fascinated to see which corners of our comfortable modern world are about to witness the horrors our ancestors both endured and inflicted. Tonight, I'll guide you through the most wicked punishments ever devised by medieval minds, from the slow, excruciating death of breaking on the wheel, where victims could remain conscious for days as crows pecked at their shattered limbs, to the horrific Judas cradle that slowly impaled victims over hours of agony. You'll discover why medieval justice wasn't just about punishing criminals, but about creating such unforgettable displays of suffering that anyone watching would be permanently scarred by the memory. We'll explore how your social status could mean the difference between a quick beheading and being drawn and quartered while still conscious. You'll learn how medieval authorities turned punishment into theater, attracting crowds who brought their children to watch as human bodies were systematically destroyed in ways that would make modern horror films seem tame by comparison. So dim the lights and prepare yourself. The medieval world of crime and punishment you're about to experience isn't just uncomfortable, it's a relentless assault on every sense that will make you profoundly grateful to live in an era where even the worst criminals aren't subjected to such ingenious cruelty. The screams alone would haunt you for a lifetime, but that's merely the beginning of your journey into medieval justice. The Theater of Agony, Public Punishment as Spectacle. Congratulations, you've just stolen a bolt of cloth worth 13 silver pennies from a merchant's stall in medieval London. The year is 1348, and your empty stomach drove you to a decision that will end your life in ways specifically designed to maximize your suffering while entertaining a crowd of hundreds. The hue and cry went up almost immediately when the merchant spotted you. "Stop, thief!" The shout that obligated every person who heard it to join the pursuit. No police force existed, but you faced something arguably more effective, an entire community legally bound to chase you down. Cornered in an alley, you were beaten before being dragged to the sheriff's men, your face bloodied, ribs cracked from kicks delivered by outraged citizens. Your trial is shockingly brief. The evidence? The stolen cloth found in your possession, and the testimony of the merchant and 3 witnesses who saw you flee. No forensic evidence, no careful cross-examination, just the simple fact that you were caught red-handed. The jury, 12 men who likely know the merchant personally, deliberates for less than 10 minutes before pronouncing you guilty. The judge's sentence falls like a physical blow. You shall be taken from here to the place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until dead. 13 pennies worth of cloth has just cost you your life. But the true horror of medieval justice isn't the disproportionate sentence. It's what happens next. You're not executed immediately. Instead, you're thrown into a dungeon to await the next public hanging day, sometimes weeks away. Medieval authorities understood that efficiency wasn't the point. Spectacle was. Executions were scheduled for maximum attendance, often on market days when the largest crowds would be present. Your death isn't just punishment, it's entertainment and warning combined. The dungeon itself is a foretaste of hell, a lightless pit where you're chained among other condemned prisoners, lying in your own filth, fed barely enough moldy bread and fetid water to keep you alive until your scheduled execution. Rats gnaw at the weaker prisoners who can't fight them off. Disease spreads unchecked. Some prisoners don't survive to reach their execution, cheating the crowds of their spectacle. But you survive. And on execution day, you're dragged from your cell, weak and filthy, to face your final hours. The hanging isn't conducted in some discreet location at dawn with few witnesses. Instead, you're loaded onto a cart with other condemned prisoners and paraded slowly through town. The route is deliberately long, winding through the busiest streets where spectators line up to jeer, throw rotten food and excrement, and scream abuse. This last journey serves multiple purposes: public humiliation, entertainment for the crowd, and perhaps most importantly, a warning to anyone considering similar crimes. At the gallows, which are permanently erected at a prominent location outside town, a festival atmosphere prevails. Vendors sell food and ale. Children sit on parents' shoulders for a better view. The wealthy have paid for the best viewing positions. The crowd might number in the thousands for a hanging day, their excitement palpable. Medieval hanging wasn't the clinical, quick death procedure of later centuries, designed to break the neck instantly. There was no careful calculation of drop distance based on the condemned's weight. Instead, you're forced up a ladder or cart. The noose is placed around your neck, and you're simply pushed off, or the cart is pulled away. What follows is slow strangulation rather than a broken neck, your legs kicking desperately as you slowly asphyxiate over several minutes. The crowd cheers particularly vigorous death throes or laughs at the spectacle of your body voiding itself as muscles relax. If you're fortunate, death comes within 5 minutes. If not, you might twist and struggle for 15 minutes or more before consciousness finally fades. Some family members of the condemned would pull on their loved one's legs to hasten death, an act of mercy in this context. After death, your punishment isn't necessarily complete. Your body might remain hanging for days or weeks as a warning, birds pecking at your decomposing flesh. For more serious crimes, your corpse could be dipped in tar to preserve it longer, ensuring the warning remains visible for months. This public spectacle of suffering was the centerpiece of medieval justice, a system based not on rehabilitation or proportional punishment, but on creating such memorable displays of agony that potential criminals would be deterred through sheer terror. The hierarchy of death, how your status determined your suffering. In medieval justice, even death wasn't democratic. The method of your execution depended not just on your crime, but on who you were. The social hierarchy that defined every aspect of medieval life extended into the realm of punishment, creating a grotesque system where even in death, privilege mattered. For nobles convicted of capital crimes, beheading was the customary punishment, considered honorable and relatively quick. A clean stroke from a sharp axe or sword could separate head from body in an instant. But even this merciful death could go horribly wrong. Executioners varied widely in skill, and many beheadings required multiple strokes, with contemporary accounts describing up to 15 blows being needed to complete some executions. Imagine the horror of consciousness, potentially continuing after the first, second, or even third failed stroke. For commoners, hanging was standard, but for crimes deemed particularly heinous, far worse awaited. Treason, for example, carried the punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, perhaps the most gruesome execution method in English history. The condemned would be dragged to the execution site on a hurdle, a wooden frame, rather than allowed to walk, causing injuries from the rough ground. Hanged until near death, but deliberately cut down while still conscious. Laid out on a table where the executioner would cut open the abdomen and remove the intestines and other organs, burning them before the still living victim's eyes. Beheaded once these tortures were complete. The body divided into 4 quarters, each sent to different locations for public display. The head typically dipped in tar and displayed on a pike at a prominent location like London Bridge. Women found guilty of treason or petty treason, killing a husband or master, faced burning at the stake rather than drawing and quartering, not out of mercy, but from a perverse sense of modesty that made public disembowelment of women seem improper. Burning brought its own unique horrors. Executioners sometimes strangled victims before lighting the fire as an act of mercy, but this was far from universal. Many victims remained fully conscious, as flames consumed them from the feet upward, a process that could take 30 minutes or more, depending on wind conditions and the type of wood used. For crimes involving forgery or counterfeiting, boiling to death became law under Henry VIII. The condemned would be immersed in a cauldron of boiling water, oil, or lead. Records from 1530 describe a man who roared mighty loud as he was gradually lowered into boiling water over a period of 2 hours. Religious heretics faced specific punishments designed for maximum symbolic impact. Burning alive was common, but the method was carefully controlled to prolong suffering. Wet wood would be used to create more smoke, suffocating victims before flames could deliver the mercy of faster death. Alternatively, extremely dry wood placed only around the legs would ensure the victim's upper body remained intact and conscious longer while their lower extremities burned away. Those who committed suicide faced posthumous punishment. Since suicide was considered both a crime and a sin, the body would be buried at a crossroads with a stake driven through it to prevent the restless spirit from wandering. All possessions would be forfeited to the crown, often leaving the family destitute. This practice continued well into the 17th century. Even the location of execution carried social significance. Tower Hill was reserved for nobles, while common criminals faced death at Tyburn or similar public execution grounds. This spatial segregation ensured that even in death, the social hierarchy remained intact. Perhaps most disturbing to modern sensibilities was the medieval approach to determining guilt in the first place. Before trial by jury became standard, many areas used trial by ordeal. Physical tests believed to reveal divine judgment. These included ordeal by fire. The accused would carry a red-hot iron bar for a set distance. Their burns would be bandaged, and if they were healed after 3 days, they were declared innocent. If infection set in, as it almost invariably did, they were guilty. Ordeal by water. The accused would be bound and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were guilty, rejected by the pure water. If they sank, they were innocent, accepted by the water, though they might drown before being retrieved. Trial by combat. Accuser and accused, or their champions, would fight until one yielded or died, with God presumably giving victory to the righteous party. This method heavily favored the wealthy who could afford skilled champions. These methods reveal the fundamental difference between medieval and modern conceptions of justice. Where modern systems at least nominally seek truth and proportional punishment, medieval justice sought divine confirmation of guilt and spectacular displays of punishment that would resonate throughout society as warnings. The Instruments of Agony, medieval punishment devices. Beyond the more common execution methods like hanging and beheading, medieval authorities developed an astonishing array of specialized torture and punishment devices. These weren't simply tools for ending life, but carefully engineered instruments to maximize suffering, humiliation, and public spectacle. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, represented one of the most horrific execution methods ever devised. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would use an iron hammer to methodically break every major bone in their body, arms, legs, and finally the spine, without delivering any immediately fatal blow. The shattered, still-living victim would then be woven through the spokes of the wheel, which was mounted on a pole for public display. Death might take days, with birds pecking at the helpless victim, who remained fully conscious through much of the ordeal. Records indicate that some victims survived up to 4 days in this state before finally expiring from exposure, dehydration, or shock. For non-capital offenses or to extract confessions, the strappetto provided medieval authorities with a torture method that caused excruciating pain while rarely killing the victim outright. The prisoner's hands were tied behind their back and connected to a rope hanging from a ceiling beam. They would be hoisted up and then suddenly dropped, but not all the way to the ground. The jerking stopped dislocated shoulders and often broke arms, with the process repeated until confession or the torturer's satisfaction. The squassation variation added weights to the feet, ensuring more severe injuries with each drop. The Judas cradle epitomized the medieval genius for psychological as well as physical torture. This pyramid-shaped seat, with the point facing upward, would be positioned beneath a restrained victim, who would be gradually lowered onto it, the point penetrating the anus or vagina. Weights might be added to the victim's legs, and the torture could last hours or days, with the victim unable to maintain any position that didn't result in further penetration and tearing of sensitive tissues. The psychological terror of this device often proved as effective as its physical application. For punishment of scolds, women deemed too argumentative or gossipy, the branks or scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted over the head with a piece that depressed the tongue, served as both punishment and public humiliation. Unable to speak and often drooling uncontrollably, women would be led through town on a chain, sometimes for days. Some versions included spikes that pierced the tongue if the woman attempted to speak. Beyond pain and humiliation, this device could cause permanent damage to the tongue and jaw. Thumb screws might seem simplistic compared to larger devices, but their effectiveness was undeniable. These metal vices crushed fingers or toes incrementally, with executioners skilled at applying just enough pressure to cause maximum pain without rendering the digit completely useless. Variations included heated metal elements or spikes within the vise. The particular horror of thumb screws lay in their precision, targeting the areas with the highest concentration of nerve endings. The pair of anguish, designed for specific orifices, mouth, anus, or vagina, consisted of a metal bulb that could be expanded by turning a key or screw mechanism. Once inserted into the victim's body, the torturer would expand the segments, causing agonizing pain and internal damage. Different versions were designed for different crimes, one for heretics, forced into the mouth, one for homosexuals, anal insertion, and one for women accused of sexual misconduct, vaginal insertion. The head crusher worked exactly as its name suggests. The victim's chin was placed on a metal bar while a cap was slowly screwed down onto the top of the skull. As pressure increased, teeth shattered first, then the jaw, before the skull finally cracked. Torturers skilled with this device could keep victims conscious through most of the process, stopping just short of death if a confession was the goal rather than execution. Even execution by hanging saw technological innovation with the introduction of the short drop method. Unlike long drop, hanging designed to break the neck instantly, short drop hanging used a drop insufficient to break the neck, but enough to close the airway. The victim would dance at the end of the rope, strangling slowly over 10 to 20 minutes rather than dying quickly. Spectators often commented on particularly vigorous or lengthy dances as a form of entertainment. For crimes not warranting death, permanent marking ensured criminals were forever identifiable. Branding with hot irons left permanent scars indicating specific crimes: T for theft, F for felon, M for murderer, V for vagrant. These marks eliminated any chance of reintegration into society, effectively creating a permanent underclass of marked criminals. These devices share common characteristics that reveal medieval attitudes toward justice. They prioritized public spectacle and deterrence over humane treatment. They often incorporated symbolic elements, connecting the punishment to the crime. They were designed to prolong suffering rather than end life quickly. They frequently caused permanent disfigurement, ensuring the criminal remained marked even if they survived. The engineering ingenuity devoted to these instruments of suffering suggests a culture obsessed with controlling behavior through spectacular displays of state power manifested on the bodies of transgressors. The message was clear: the punishment would be so horrific that it would live forever in the memory of witnesses, deterring future crimes through sheer terror. The living death, non-lethal punishments that destroyed lives. While execution methods tend to dominate discussions of medieval punishment, non-lethal penalties could be equally devastating, creating a kind of living death where survivors remained permanently marked, disabled, or socially ostracized. These punishments transform criminals into walking warnings, their damaged bodies serving as mobile advertisements of state power. Mutilation ranked among the most common, non-capital punishments, specifically designed to mark criminals permanently while often preventing them from returning to their criminal activities. Thieves frequently lost hands or fingers, not only as punishment, but as a preventative measure. Records from the 13th century England show that a first-time thief might lose a thumb, a second offense could cost an entire hand, and a third typically resulted in hanging. This graduated approach created a visible criminal record written on the body itself. For those who committed perjury or spread sedition, tongue removal or piercing ensured they could never again misuse speech. Forgers and counterfeiters might lose the fingers used to practice their craft. These targeted mutilations had economic as well as punitive purposes, making it impossible for criminals to return to their previous activities while permanently marking them for public identification. Facial mutilation served both punitive and identificatory functions. Slitting the nostrils was common for certain crimes, while more severe offenses might warrant complete removal of the nose or ears. Unlike hidden scars, these facial mutilations ensured that criminals carried their record publicly for life, unable to escape identification or reintegrate into society. Women convicted of adultery or prostitution often faced specific facial disfigurements designed to destroy their beauty, reflecting society's particular anxiety about female sexuality. The pillory and stocks, restraint devices that held offenders in public places, seem relatively mild by comparison, but could result in death depending on weather conditions, length of sentence, and public reaction. The pillory, which restrained the head and hands, left victims particularly vulnerable to crowd abuse. Beyond the throwing of refuse and excrement, pillory victims might be stoned, suffer permanent eye damage from projectiles, or develop hypothermia in winter conditions. A sentence of 3 days in the pillory during winter could be an effective death sentence without officially imposing capital punishment. Whipping deserves special mention for its ubiquity in medieval justice. Public flogging wasn't simply a painful experience, but a deliberately humiliating one, with victims often stripped to the waist or entirely naked, depending on the nature of their crime. The number of lashes was carefully specified in sentencing, with some records showing penalties of up to 300 strokes, far beyond what many could survive without serious medical consequences. Specialized whips with multiple tails, cat-o'-nine tails, or added metal or bone fragments ensured maximum tissue damage. Victims often carried these scars for life, their backs a permanent record of their punishment. Branding with hot irons left permanent marks indicating specific crimes, typically on exposed areas like the hand, cheek, or forehead to ensure visibility. The letter used often corresponded to the crime, T for theft, B for blasphemy, V for vagrant. These marks made it virtually impossible for branded individuals to find legitimate employment or reintegrate into society, effectively creating a permanent criminal underclass identifiable at a glance. Imprisonment itself, while less common than in modern justice systems, could be a prolonged death sentence. Medieval prisons lacked any concept of prisoner welfare, with inmates typically responsible for their own food and necessities. Those without family support or financial resources often starved. Dungeons were frequently underground chambers, with no sanitation, natural light, or ventilation. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, with mortality rates so high that long prison sentences were relatively rare, not because of mercy, but because few survived extended confinement. Public humiliation punishments, while causing no direct physical harm, could destroy social standing and livelihood just as effectively as mutilation. The shame walk, where criminals were paraded through town wearing signs detailing their crimes, often while riding backward on donkeys, could permanently ruin reputation in communities where social standing was essential for economic survival. For prostitutes or adulterers, the cucking stool, a chair used to repeatedly dunk women in water, combined physical discomfort, hypothermia risk, and public humiliation. Particularly innovative was the use of animal masks, or heads of shame, forced upon criminals during public parades. Different animals symbolized different crimes: pig masks for gluttony, donkey for stupidity, fox for cunning and theft. These spectacles were deliberately theatrical, designed to draw crowds and create memorable public examples. Banishment served as both punishment and community protection. Those banished were often first mutilated or branded to ensure they couldn't simply relocate and resume criminal activities unrecognized. The sentence, banished on pain of death, meant exactly that. Returning to the jurisdiction after banishment was typically a capital offense. In a world without social safety nets or easy travel, banishment often amounted to an indirect death sentence, particularly for the elderly or infirm. For religious offenses, excommunication functioned as a form of social death. The excommunicated person was cut off from all sacraments, barred from church, and often shunned by the community. Since religious and social life were inseparable in medieval society, excommunication effectively removed individuals from the social world entirely, making normal life virtually impossible. These non-lethal punishments reveal a justice system focused not on rehabilitation, but on creating visible examples and removing corrupting elements from society. The criminal's body became public property, a surface upon which the power of authority could be permanently written. Those who survived their punishments often faced a fate that many considered worse than death, a half-life of pain, disability, social rejection, and economic destitution that could last decades, serving as living reminders of the consequences of crossing medieval authority. The divine judgment, religious influence on medieval punishment. Medieval justice operated within a worldview that saw divine and secular authority as inextricably linked. Religious concepts profoundly shaped both the determination of guilt and the administration of punishment, creating a system where earthly suffering was viewed as a prelude to potential divine mercy. Trial by ordeal represented the most direct intersection of religious belief and judicial practice. These physical tests, carrying hot iron, immersion in water, or trial by combat, weren't simply methods of determining guilt, but were understood as invitations for divine intervention. Priests blessed the instruments and water used in ordeals, transforming these tests into quasi-sacramental actions. The fundamental premise was that God would protect the innocent from harm, intervening miraculously to prevent injury to the wrongfully accused. The Church's ambiguous relationship with capital punishment created a system of theatrical responsibility shifting. Ecclesiastical courts could not officially pronounce death sentences due to the principle that the Church abhors blood. Instead, convicted heretics would be relaxed to the secular arm, formally handed over to civil authorities with the understanding they would be executed. This legal fiction allowed the Church to maintain technical distance from the killing while ensuring it occurred. Punishment itself carried explicitly religious dimensions. Public executions included ritualistic elements like the condemned making public confession, receiving last rites, and often delivering speeches acknowledging divine justice. Executioners would sometimes ask forgiveness from their victims before carrying out the sentence, reinforcing that they were instruments of necessary justice rather than murderers. Religious authorities maintained their own parallel justice system through ecclesiastical courts. These courts had jurisdiction over the clergy, benefit of clergy, matrimonial cases, and spiritual offenses like heresy, blasphemy, or failing to attend church. Punishments included public penance, where sinners might be forced to stand barefoot in church holding candles, wear distinctive clothing marking their sin, or undergo public whipping at church doors. The ultimate ecclesiastical punishment was excommunication, complete exclusion from the church community and sacraments. In a society where religious and social life were inseparable, this amounted to a form of living death. The excommunicated person was effectively outside human society, unable to participate in normal community life, and believed to be damned eternally unless reconciled before death. Churches provided sanctuary for those fleeing justice, a religious institution acknowledged by secular law. Fugitives could claim sanctuary in a church for up to 40 days, during which they were protected from arrest. After this period, they had to either surrender to authorities or abjure the realm, confess their crimes, and accept permanent exile from England, walking to a designated port, carrying a wooden cross, and taking the first ship out of the country. The concept of purgatory heavily influenced medieval punishment philosophy. Physical suffering was viewed as potentially reducing time in purgatory, creating a theological justification for harsh punishments as spiritually beneficial. Some condemned criminals would request more painful deaths in the belief this additional suffering would reduce their punishment in the afterlife. Certain execution methods carried specific religious symbolism. Burning at the stake for heresy symbolically prefigured the hellfire awaiting the unrepentant. Breaking on the wheel referenced Saint Catherine's martyrdom. Even hanging involved symbolic elements, the drop representing the fall from grace, the noose the circle of eternity. Religious beliefs about specific sins created distinctive punishments. Suicide, considered both a crime against the state and a sin against God for rejecting his gift of life, carried unique posthumous penalties. The suicide's body would be buried at a crossroads with a stake through the heart, denied Christian burial, and their property forfeited to the crown, punishing the family for failing to prevent the act. Witch trials represent perhaps the most complete fusion of religious belief and judicial process. The identification, trial, and execution of supposed witches followed procedures outlined in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, creating a system where theological concepts directly shaped legal outcomes. Witchcraft accusations often targeted marginal community members, particularly older women, whose punishment reinforced both religious orthodoxy and social conformity. The religious dimension of medieval punishment created a comprehensive worldview where justice operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical punishment satisfied earthly justice while potentially serving as spiritual purgation. Public confession and acknowledgement of sin before execution offered a path to divine mercy, despite earthly condemnation. The suffering body became a site where divine and secular power intersected, each reinforcing the other's authority. This theological framework helps explain why medieval punishments appear so extreme to modern sensibilities. They weren't simply addressing earthly crimes, but engaging in cosmic warfare against sin, with each public execution serving as a morality play demonstrating both temporal and divine consequences for transgression. The criminal's suffering body became a text through which religious and political authorities wrote messages of power and salvation for the watching community. The gradual separation of religious and secular authority would eventually transform Western justice systems, but throughout the medieval period, the condemned criminal faced not just the judgment of human courts, but the terrifying prospect of divine judgment to follow, making the stake, gallows, or wheel not just the end of earthly life, but potentially the gateway to eternal suffering. Understood. I'll continue with the style of the earlier sections, providing additional content on medieval punishment without the extreme graphic detail. Here are new sections to expand your content. The psychology of public punishment. The medieval approach to punishment wasn't merely about inflicting pain or eliminating criminals from society. It was a sophisticated system of psychological control that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Understanding the psychological dimensions of medieval justice helps explain why such seemingly excessive cruelty was considered necessary and effective. Public executions functioned as theatrical performances carefully orchestrated to maximize psychological impact. The extended journey to the gallows wasn't simply logistical, but designed to create a narrative arc. The criminal's final procession through familiar streets, the crowd's participation through jeers and thrown objects, the ritual of last words and confession, and finally, the spectacular moment of death itself. This dramatic structure allowed spectators to experience catharsis while absorbing the central message about authority and transgression. Medieval authorities understood intuitively what modern psychologists call vicarious conditioning, learning through observing others' experiences rather than direct personal experience. By making punishment public and memorable, they created powerful learning moments for the entire community. The teenager watching a thief hang for stealing goods worth 15 pennies internalized boundaries more effectively than through abstract warnings or written laws. The location of punishment sites was strategically chosen to maximize psychological impact. Gallows were typically placed at city boundaries or major crossroads, creating liminal spaces that represented the threshold between law-abiding society and the chaos beyond. These locations symbolically reinforced the idea that criminals had placed themselves outside the protection of civilized order and served as constant reminders to travelers entering or leaving the community. The sounds of punishment formed a crucial part of its psychological effectiveness. The agonized screams of the tortured were not an incidental byproduct, but a central feature of the deterrent strategy. Contemporary accounts describe how these sounds carried across medieval towns, penetrating closed doors and shuttered windows, making it impossible for anyone, even those who avoided watching, to escape awareness of punishment in progress. This acoustic dimension created what modern psychologists might call a soundscape of terror that pervaded entire communities. The deliberate preservation and display of executed bodies served ongoing psychological purposes. Corpses left hanging on gibbets, heads displayed on spikes, or quartered remains exhibited at town gates created persistent visual reminders of authorities' reach. These displays transformed from acute spectacle to chronic presence in public consciousness, a constant subconscious reinforcement of the consequences of criminal behavior. The progressive decay of these remains, from from recognizable human to anonymous skeleton, itself taught lessons about mortality and the impermanence of worldly concerns. For those subjected to non-lethal punishments like mutilation or branding, the psychological consequences often proved more devastating than the physical pain. Survivors bore visible markers that transformed their social identity, creating what sociologists would now call master status, a single characteristic that overshadows all other aspects of identity. A merchant who lost a hand for forgery ceased being primarily identified as a merchant, father, or community member, becoming instead the handless forger, whose defining characteristic was his criminality and punishment. The psychological sophistication of medieval punishment extended to its symbolic dimensions. Punishments frequently mirrored or inverted the crime in ways designed to create poetic justice visible to all observers. Forgers lost the hands that created false documents. Blasphemers had their tongues removed. Those who struck their parents lost the offending hand. This symmetry between crime and punishment created a comprehensible moral logic that reinforced social norms while satisfying the community's sense of appropriateness. Modern research on trauma suggests that witnessing extreme violence, particularly from a young age, fundamentally alters neurological development and emotional processing. Medieval children routinely observed public executions, creating generations conditioned to accept extreme violence as a normal aspect of social functioning. This normalization helped perpetuate the system, as those raised witnessing torture and execution would later support and participate in similar punishments without psychological resistance. Perhaps most significant was how medieval punishment outsourced enforcement to the entire community. By making everyone witness to consequences, the system created collective investment in maintaining order. Neighbors watched neighbors, family members monitored each other, all knowing they might be required to testify about observed misconduct. This created a distributed surveillance system where authorities' physical presence became less necessary than the internalized awareness that any community member might report transgression. The medieval approach to punishment thus operated as a comprehensive psychological ecosystem, not merely addressing individual criminals, but continuously reshaping community consciousness through strategically deployed spectacle, symbol, and shared experience. Modern justice systems, focused primarily on removing offenders from society, accomplish only one function of what was once a much more complex social technology designed to make authority visible, punishment memorable, and compliance self-sustaining through psychological management of entire communities. The economics of suffering, financial aspects of medieval punishment. Behind the blood and spectacle of medieval punishment lay sophisticated economic considerations that modern discussions often overlook. Medieval justice wasn't just about enforcement of moral codes. It was a complex system with significant financial dimensions that benefited various stakeholders while imposing devastating economic consequences on criminals and their families. Execution as public entertainment generated considerable revenue. Executions were scheduled on market days not only to ensure maximum attendance, but to create commercial opportunities. Vendors sold food, drink, and souvenirs to spectators. Premium viewing positions could be rented or sold. Printed accounts of the condemned's crimes and confessions, early true crime literature, sold briskly. A well-attended execution functioned as a macabre festival that stimulated local economies while fulfilling judicial requirements. The executioner himself operated within a complex economic framework. While employed by authorities, executioners often supplemented their income through ghoulish side businesses. They sold pieces of the execution rope as lucky charms, rendered human fat from corpses for use in folk medicines, and charged additional fees for professional courtesies, like strangling a victim before burning to reduce suffering. Some executioners developed lucrative medical practices, as they possessed unique anatomical knowledge and were among the few individuals permitted to handle dead bodies. Confiscation of property created significant revenue for medieval authorities. Many crimes, particularly treason, resulted in attainder, the legal death of the condemned that extinguished not only their life, but their property rights. All lands, goods, and chattels would be forfeited to the crown or local lord. This created obvious financial incentives for conviction, particularly when the accused held significant assets. Historical records show spikes in certain prosecutions during periods when monarchs faced financial difficulties, suggesting strategic use of judicial proceedings for revenue generation. For the condemned's family, the economic consequences extended far beyond grief. When a household's primary breadwinner was executed, the economic unit collapsed. Widows and children often fell into destitution, unable to maintain property or businesses. Medieval records show increased prostitution, begging, and petty crime among families of executed criminals, creating cycles of poverty and further criminality that stretched across generations. The bail and fine system operated as a sophisticated class-sorting mechanism. Wealthy offenders could often pay fines in lieu of corporal punishment for many offenses, effectively creating a justice system where physical suffering was reserved primarily for those without financial resources. Court records from medieval England show identical crimes resulting in hanging for poor offenders, while wealthy defendants paid fines or compensation to victims. Imprisonment itself generated revenue through the fee system. Unlike modern prisons operated at public expense, medieval jails required prisoners to pay for their own upkeep. Jailers charged for food, water, better accommodations, removal of chains, and even access to light and air. Those without resources to pay these fees experienced significantly worse conditions, creating a tiered system of suffering based on economic status. Some prisoners literally starved to death while awaiting trial because they couldn't afford food. Corporal punishments often incorporated economic dimensions beyond their obvious physical impacts. When thieves lost hands, they generally lost earning capacity, transforming productive citizens into economic burdens on families or communities. Facial disfigurement from brandings or mutilation similarly reduced economic prospects, particularly for women whose marriage opportunities, the primary economic vehicle for most medieval women, dramatically decreased after punishment. The sanctuary system, where criminals could claim temporary protection in churches, had significant economic components. After the typical 40-day sanctuary period, fugitives who chose to abjure the realm, accept exile rather than trial, forfeited all property and assets. This created another avenue for authorities to acquire property while appearing merciful by offering an alternative to execution. Some forms of punishment directly monetized the criminal body through slave labor. Galley slavery, more common in Mediterranean regions, converted criminals into literal property whose labor propelled naval vessels. Similarly, penal transportation to colonies, developed in later medieval and early modern periods, transformed criminals into forced labor, supporting economic expansion. For certain specialized crimes, notably counterfeiting and coin clipping, the economics of punishment was directly proportional to the economic damage the crime potentially caused. Counterfeiters faced particularly horrific executions, often boiling alive, because their crimes threatened the entire economic system by undermining confidence in currency, potentially creating inflation and commercial disruption far exceeding the value of the counterfeiter's direct gain. Even religious penalties carried economic dimensions. Excommunication, beyond spiritual consequences, prohibited others from conducting business with the excommunicated person, effectively imposing economic isolation. Penance might include significant donations to the church, creating revenue from the forgiveness process. Indulgences, pardons for sins in exchange for payment, eventually became so transparently economic that they helped trigger the Protestant Reformation. Medieval punishment thus operated as a complex economic ecosystem where suffering generated revenue, property transferred between social classes through judicial mechanisms, and physical penalties carried financial consequences extending far beyond the condemned individual. This economic dimension helps explain why certain punishment practices persisted despite questionable deterrent effectiveness. They served financial interests of authorities while reinforcing class structures through differential application of physical versus monetary penalties based on wealth and status. Gender and punishment, the sexualized nature of medieval justice. Medieval punishment was not gender-neutral, but contained highly sexualized dimensions that reflected and reinforced period attitudes about gender roles, sexuality, and the perceived different moral natures of men and women. Understanding these gendered aspects provides crucial insight into how medieval justice functioned as an instrument of social control beyond mere crime deterrence. For female offenders, punishments often specifically targeted sexuality and reproductive capacity. Women convicted of adultery, prostitution, or other moral offenses frequently faced public shaming that emphasized sexual humiliation. The scold's bridle, a metal cage placed over a woman's head with a piece that depressed or injured the tongue, was almost exclusively used on women deemed too argumentative or verbally assertive, literally silencing female speech, considered inappropriate. Witch trials represented perhaps the most explicitly gendered form of medieval justice. Approximately 80% of those executed for witchcraft were women, with accusations often focusing on supposed sexual relationships with demons or the devil. The interrogation and testing of accused witches frequently involved sexualized elements, searching for witch marks on intimate parts of the body, shaving of all body hair, and invasive physical examinations. The Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, a key text in witch persecution, explicitly connected female sexuality with susceptibility to demonic influence. For pregnant women, the medieval justice system created unique considerations. A woman pleading the belly, claiming pregnancy, could delay execution until after childbirth. This wasn't motivated by compassion for the woman, but by concern for the unborn child's soul and life, ensuring it could be baptized and raised, often in dire circumstances, after the mother's eventual execution. This practice acknowledged women's reproductive role while still maintaining the punishment imperative. Male and female criminals often faced different methods of execution for identical crimes. Women convicted of treason or husband murder, considered a form of petty treason, were typically burned rather than hanged, drawn, and quartered as men would be. This distinction arose not from mercy, but from notions of modesty. The disembowelment phase of male execution was considered too indecent to perform on female bodies in public. The result was effectively a different form of suffering based entirely on gender. Sexual crimes themselves carried dramatically different consequences depending on gender. Female adultery was punished severely as it threatened patrilineal inheritance, while male adultery often went unpunished or received minimal penalties. Rape was prosecuted primarily as a property crime against a woman's father or husband rather than as a violation of the woman herself. In some jurisdictions, a rapist could escape punishment by marrying his victim, transforming the crime into a legitimate relationship through forced matrimony. Punishment devices like the Judas cradle and the pear of anguish contained explicitly sexual dimensions, designed to penetrate and damage the orifices of the body in ways that mimicked and perverted sexual acts. Different versions of the pear of anguish were designed specifically for different orifices, vaginal, anal, or oral, depending on the nature of the alleged crime. This created a judicial framework where sexual penetration itself became a punishment method. For crimes involving sexual morality, women often faced public punishment designed to symbolically brand them as sexually deviant. The ducking stool, or cucking stool, which repeatedly submerged women in water, targeted scolds and shrews, women whose behavior challenged male authority. The very terminology of female punishment, loose women, fallen women, reinforced connections between spatial freedom, vertical position, and sexual morality that had no equivalent in male-focused language. Clothing and appearance manipulation formed a significant aspect of gendered punishment. Women convicted of adultery or prostitution might have their hair forcibly cut short, removing a primary symbol of femininity, be made to wear distinctive clothing marking their shame, or be forced to appear publicly in states of partial undress. These punishments specifically targeted female identity as expressed through appearance in ways that male punishments rarely addressed. The judicial process itself contained gendered elements beyond the punishments imposed. Women were often subjected to virginity tests or examinations of reproductive organs as evidence in cases involving sexual morality or suspected infanticide. Male bodies, by contrast, were rarely subjected to similar intimate examinations unless torture was being applied. This created a justice system where female bodies were considered more legitimately available for state inspection and evaluation. Torture methods sometimes varied by gender, based on beliefs about differential pain tolerance or appropriate targeting. Women were thought particularly vulnerable to certain forms of psychological torture involving children or family, while men were considered more susceptible to direct physical pain. Records of judicial torture show patterns of gender-specific application based on these beliefs about gendered vulnerability. Even sanctuary protections contained gendered dimensions. Women claiming sanctuary in churches often received different treatment than male claimants, reflecting concerns about sexual propriety during the sanctuary period. Pregnant women or those with young children presented particular challenges to the sanctuary system, sometimes receiving extended protections that connected maternal status with judicial treatment. The entire medieval conceptualization of crime and punishment rested on gendered theological foundations. Eve's original sin created a framework where women were viewed as inherently more susceptible to temptation and moral weakness, requiring stricter control and surveillance. This theological underpinning influenced everything from which crimes women were considered more likely to commit to appropriate methods for extracting confessions from female suspects. These gendered dimensions of medieval punishment reveal a justice system that wasn't merely enforcing universal laws, but actively reinforcing specific gender roles and sexual boundaries. By punishing gender transgressions alongside criminal acts, medieval justice functioned as a comprehensive system for maintaining not just legal compliance, but adherence to rigidly defined gender expectations, with women's bodies and sexuality subject to particularly intense judicial regulation and public control. Medieval incarceration, the prison before prisons. While modern justice systems center on imprisonment, medieval incarceration functioned very differently, not as the primary form of punishment, but as a temporary holding state before trial, execution, or ransoming. Yet medieval prisons existed in various forms, each revealing profoundly different attitudes toward confinement, punishment, and the purpose of restricting freedom. Medieval castles and fortifications routinely included dungeons, secure spaces for holding prisoners that were often literally dunked below ground level, creating spaces of sensory deprivation and physical hardship. These weren't designed for long-term habitation, but for temporary detention or intensive interrogation. The absence of light, fresh air, and sanitation in these spaces made extended survival difficult, with many prisoners dying from disease, exposure, or neglect while awaiting trial or execution. The economic model of medieval imprisonment differed fundamentally from modern practices. Prisons operated on a fee system where prisoners paid for their own maintenance, purchasing food, water, bedding, candles, even the removal of chains from jailers. This created a tiered experience where wealthy prisoners might live in relative comfort with private rooms, imported meals, and visitors, while the destitute might starve to death in filthy communal spaces. Jailers derived income directly from prisoners, creating incentives to extract maximum payment rather than maintain humane conditions. Physical restraints replaced architectural security in many medieval prisons. Rather than relying primarily on bars and walls, prisoners were often physically chained to floors, walls, or heavy objects that prevented movement. These restraints remained in place day and night, creating chronic injuries from metal shackles, infections where metal met flesh, permanent joint damage from fixed positions, and muscle atrophy from immobility. The sound of chains became so associated with imprisonment that the rattling alone served as psychological conditioning. Oubliettes represented perhaps the most extreme form of medieval incarceration, specialized cells designed to be entered only from above through a ceiling hatch. The prisoner would be lowered into a space too small to lie down fully, with no doors and often no light source. The name itself derives from the French oublier, to forget, as prisoners placed in these spaces were effectively meant to be forgotten. Some oubliettes included design elements like sloped floors with drainage channels to accommodate the slow death of the occupant without requiring body removal. Tower prisons created a different experience of confinement, often reserved for higher status prisoners. Tower rooms typically offered more space and occasionally windows, but height created its own form of security and psychological impact. The physical separation from ground level reinforced the prisoner's removal from normal society. In winter, these elevated spaces became bitterly cold. In summer, they trapped heat. The Tower of London remains perhaps the most famous example, holding prisoners ranging from common criminals to deposed royalty. Church prisons operated under different principles, focusing on penance rather than purely punitive aims. Monastic orders developed penitential cells, where offending monks or clerics would be confined for spiritual reflection and reform. These spaces typically allowed basic devotional items and sometimes religious texts, reflecting the corrective rather than merely punitive approach. This ecclesiastical model eventually influenced secular imprisonment, introducing the concept that confinement might reform rather than simply hold or punish offenders. For women, imprisonment carried additional dimensions of gender-specific vulnerability. Female prisoners faced high rates of sexual assault by jailers and male prisoners in shared facilities. Some jurisdictions created separate women's quarters in prisons, though these often received fewer resources and less attention than male areas. Pregnant women or those with infants faced particularly harsh circumstances, sometimes giving birth in chains or watching children sicken in prison environments. Records show higher mortality for women in medieval prisons, particularly during childbirth or postpartum periods without adequate care. The sensory experience of medieval imprisonment created its own form of torture. The constant darkness damaged vision over time. The omnipresent smell of human waste, unwashed bodies, and occasionally corpses created an olfactory assault that prisoners reported never fully adjusting to. Infestations of rats, lice, fleas, and other vermin added another layer of constant torment. The acoustic environment, moans, screams, the rattling of chains, dripping water, created sleep deprivation and psychological distress that contemporary accounts describe as maddening beyond all other hardships. Some specialized forms of confinement created particularly severe experiences. Little ease cells were constructed too small for an adult to stand upright, sit comfortably, or lie fully extended, forcing the prisoner into constantly shifting cramped positions that prevented sleep and created extreme physical distress without active torture. Drowning cells, located below the waterline in coastal fortifications, would partially flood at high tide, forcing prisoners to stand for hours to avoid drowning, then recede, creating a predictable rhythm of terror and temporary relief. Perhaps most significantly, medieval incarceration lacked defined sentences in most cases. Prisoners remained confined until trial, execution, payment of debts, or ransoming, periods of indeterminate length that could extend from days to decades. This temporal uncertainty created profound psychological stress beyond the physical hardships of confinement, as prisoners had no definite endpoint to anticipate. Records show individuals forgotten in prison systems for years after the original reasons for their detention had become moot. The development of bridewells, named after the first such institution at Bridewell Palace in London in the later medieval period, marked an important transition toward recognizing work as a component of punishment. These facilities housed minor offenders, vagrants, and the disorderly poor, requiring them to perform labor during confinement. This concept, that imprisonment might combine detention with productive activity, represented a significant shift toward modern conceptualizations of incarceration as more than just detention. By examining these varied forms of medieval confinement, we see a system that hadn't yet conceived of imprisonment itself as the primary punishment, but used detention in diverse ways, as holding pattern, as supplementary hardship before execution, as leverage for payment, as spiritual correction, and occasionally as a mercy for those who might otherwise face execution. This multifaceted approach to restricting freedom reflected the complex social, economic, and theological frameworks of medieval justice, where confinement represented just one component in a broader system of controlling bodies and behaviors through institutional power. The spectacle of medieval execution, theater, ritual, and message. Medieval executions weren't merely the mechanical implementation of death sentences, but elaborate public performances with carefully choreographed elements designed to maximize their impact on witnesses. Understanding these events as theatrical productions reveals how authorities transformed the destruction of human bodies into powerful tools of social control and political communication. The execution journey began long before the actual death. Condemned prisoners were often held in public view for days or weeks beforehand, displayed in cages or windows where passers-by could observe them, creating anticipation and extending the spectacle beyond the execution itself. Officials would announce upcoming executions by town criers, posting notices, and ringing specific bell patterns that the population recognized as heralding judicial death, ensuring maximum attendance. On execution day, the processional route was deliberately extended to pass through the busiest sections of town, transforming the condemned's final journey into a slow parade of misery. The prisoner might be pulled on a hurdle or cart rather than allowed to walk, already beginning the process of dehumanization. Stops at significant locations, the site of their crime, important churches or government buildings, created a literal Stations of the Cross parallel that reinforced the religious dimensions of judicial punishment. The timing of executions followed theatrical principles. Market days were preferred to ensure large audiences. Executions typically occurred around noon, providing optimal lighting for visibility while allowing sufficient time for the completion of complex execution methods before darkness. Seasonal considerations affected scheduling, with authorities sometimes delaying executions until weather would permit maximum attendance. Execution grounds themselves functioned as theatrical venues with established sightlines and viewing hierarchies. Permanent scaffolds were constructed with elevated platforms, ensuring visibility from distance. Wealthier spectators could rent windows or balconies overlooking the site, creating literal box seats for the performance of death. The poor might climb trees or stand on carts for better vantage points, sometimes paying for these improvised accommodations. The condemned's appearance was managed for maximum symbolic impact. They were typically dressed in white, symbolizing the shroud in preparation for death, or in clothes indicating their crime, false insignia for impersonators, reversed garments for traitors. Specific props might be attached to them. For example, the theft object hung around a thief's neck, or falsified documents pinned to a forger's chest, creating immediate visual communication of their transgression. Executioners themselves developed theatrical personae through distinctive clothing and masks that transformed them from ordinary community members into symbolic agents of death. Their ceremonial approach to their tools, displaying, cleaning, or blessing the axe, rope, or other implements before use, created dramatic tension and emphasis on the technological apparatus of death. The executioner's request for forgiveness from the condemned before performing their duty added another ritual element, acknowledging the grave moral weight of sanctioned killing. The condemned's final speech constituted a crucial, dramatic monologue within the execution performance. These speeches were expected to follow established conventions: confession of guilt, expression of remorse, warning to others against similar crimes, forgiveness of enemies, and affirmation of the justice of their punishment. While some prisoners deviated from this script, using their last words for protest, proclamations of innocence, or political statements, such departures themselves became noteworthy, dramatic moments that authorities sought to control or curtail. Religious elements provided a structured framework for the execution narrative. Priests accompanied the condemned, offering last rites and spiritual comfort that emphasized the event's transcendent meaning beyond mere punishment. Prayers were incorporated at specific points in the execution process, creating rhythm and familiar ritual touchstones for the audience. The offering of a crucifix to kiss before the final moment linked the state's punishment to divine judgment and potential redemption. The specifics of death itself were calibrated for maximum visual impact. Executioners developed techniques that emphasized the spectacular: the arterial spray of beheading, the dramatic drop of hanging, the visible internal organs revealed in disembowelment. Certain elements became anticipated set pieces that audiences specifically gathered to witness. The head held aloft after beheading, the executioner's proclamation of completion, or the mandatory wait time before a hanging victim could be cut down. Post-mortem treatment of the body extended the spectacle beyond the moment of death. Heads displayed on poles, bodies left hanging for days or weeks, quartered remains sent to different locations, all created enduring physical manifestations of the execution's message. These displays transformed from acute spectacle to chronic reminder, with decomposition itself becoming part of the ongoing visual narrative as flesh blackened, bloated, and eventually fell away to reveal skeleton. Commercial aspects surrounded the theatrical core, creating a festival atmosphere that both attracted attendance and associated punishment with commerce and celebration. Food vendors, souvenir sellers, and entertainers operated around execution grounds. Printed broadsheets describing the condemned's crimes and confession, often embellished for dramatic effect, sold briskly. Pieces of the execution rope, clothing from the deceased, or even body parts might be sold as souvenirs or folk magic items. Audience participation formed a critical component of execution theater. Crowds were expected to respond vocally, shouting approval at the sentence, jeering the condemned, or expressing satisfaction at particularly well-executed deaths. This chorus effect reinforced community endorsement of the punishment and collective participation in judicial violence. The crowd might also physically participate by throwing objects at the prisoner during their final procession, or, in extreme cases, literally tearing the condemned's body apart in group-enacted violence that authorities sometimes permitted as extension of official punishment. The theatrical nature of executions served multiple social and political purposes simultaneously. For authorities, the spectacle demonstrated power through the state's absolute control over life and death. For religious institutions, it reinforced moral boundaries and the consequences of transgression. For spectators, it provided cathartic release of social tensions through sanctioned violence. For the condemned, the performance offered a final opportunity to reclaim some dignity through appropriate death behavior, potentially transforming their legacy from simple criminal to repentant sinner or even martyr. Most significantly, the theatrical execution created transfer of memory through trauma. The extreme emotional impact of witnessing judicial killing ensured that spectators, especially children seeing their first execution, would retain vivid memories of the consequences of crime. This trauma-based learning proved more effective than abstract legal codes or moral teachings in shaping compliant behavior, embedding the lessons of authority directly in the emotional and sensory experience of witnesses. By analyzing medieval executions as theatrical productions rather than merely judicial procedures, we see how authorities transformed necessary deaths into optimal teaching moments, leveraging dramatic principles to maximize the social control value of each execution. The condemned person's destruction became simultaneously entertainment, moral instruction, religious ritual, and political statement, a multi-dimensional performance whose psychological and social impacts extended far beyond the simple termination of a criminal life. Child criminals, the brutal reality of youth justice in medieval times. Modern sensibilities about protecting children from harsh adult penalties developed relatively recently in historical terms. Medieval justice systems applied a dramatically different approach to young offenders, one that reflected period conceptions of childhood, sin, and criminal responsibility that would shock contemporary observers in both their severity and their occasional surprising leniency. The age of criminal responsibility in medieval systems typically began around 7 years old, the age of reason in Catholic doctrine, when children were believed capable of understanding the difference between right and wrong. This theological concept carried direct judicial consequences, making even young children subject to formal criminal proceedings and potentially severe punishments. Before 7, children were generally considered incapable of criminal intent, though parents might still be punished for their actions. Between ages 7 and 14, sometimes extended to 16 for girls, children inhabited a legal gray area where they could be prosecuted, but might receive modified punishments depending on the crime's severity, their perceived maturity, and local judicial custom. Courts assessed juvenile offenders' capacity for understanding on a case-by-case basis, rather than applying strict age boundaries. A mature 10-year-old might face adult penalties, while a simple 14-year-old received leniency. For serious crimes like murder or arson, even young children could face execution. Records document children as young as 8 being hanged for arson, considered particularly serious as it endangered entire communities, and murder. However, such extreme penalties for the very young were relatively rare and often generated community discomfort. Judges sometimes explicitly noted a child's age as reason for clemency, even when the law technically permitted execution. Theft, the most common juvenile offense, resulted in more variable treatment. Children stealing food due to hunger might receive relative leniency, while those stealing valuable goods often faced harsh physical punishment. Court records show children as young as 9 being flogged at the cart's tail, whipped while being pulled through town, exposed in stocks sized for their smaller bodies, or branded with T for theft on the thumb rather than the forehead, a location that could eventually be concealed in adulthood. The benefit of clergy, a legal loophole allowing those who could read to claim clerical status and receive lighter punishment, provided particular advantage to children from educated backgrounds. Since the reading test typically involved only reciting a specific psalm, the neck verse, children who had any education could often pass this test. This created significant class disparity in outcomes, with literate children escaping corporal punishment for crimes that would result in execution or mutilation for illiterate peers. Counterintuitively, some aspects of medieval justice proved less harsh toward children than later systems. While corporal punishment was readily applied to young offenders, medieval courts rarely imposed long-term imprisonment on children, partly because incarceration itself was less common, and partly from pragmatic recognition that children required care, adults did not. A child might be flogged severely, but then released rather than confined in conditions that would likely prove fatal. Punishment often reflected practical considerations about children's economic value. Orphaned or abandoned children who committed crimes might be sentenced to apprenticeships or service, rather than physical punishment, effectively using the judicial system to address labor needs while providing supervision for wayward youths. Court records show children sentenced to years of service to tradespeople or landowners as a corrective measure that simultaneously addressed labor shortages. The medieval approach to juvenile justice reflected the reality that childhood itself was a different experience than in modern times. Children as young as 7 routinely worked, contributing substantially to family economies. A child responsible enough to tend sheep, work fields, or assist in workshops was considered responsible enough to face consequences for criminal behavior. The medieval legal system simply mirrored the broader social reality that childhood constituted a brief transitional period rather than a protected developmental stage. Gender affected juvenile justice significantly. Girls faced particular scrutiny for sexual or moral offenses from early ages. Records show girls as young as 12 being punished for prostitution or lewd behavior, reflecting the different standards applied to female sexuality even before adulthood. Conversely, boys more commonly face charges for property crimes and violence, with courts sometimes explicitly noting that boyish mischief justified limited leniency for certain offenses. Parental responsibility for children's crimes created a parallel punishment system. When very young children committed crimes, parents might be flogged, fined, or otherwise punished in their stead. This practice reflected the belief that children's misbehavior stemmed from inadequate parental discipline and supervision. Even when children were old enough to face direct punishment, parents often received supplementary penalties for failing to properly control their offspring. Orphans and abandoned children encountered particularly harsh treatment when accused of crimes, lacking family advocates to argue for leniency or provide character witnesses. These children were more likely to receive maximum penalties or be sentenced to institutional confinement in workhouses or religious facilities. This disadvantage reflected the broader medieval association between family structure and moral character. Children without proper family oversight were presumed more prone to persistent criminality. Some juvenile offenders faced distinctive shaming punishments designed specifically for younger criminals. Children might be required to wear signs describing their offenses, stand in public with symbols of their crimes, or undergo ceremonial punishment at school or church. These penalties leveraged children's particular vulnerability to peer judgment and community disapproval, creating deterrents that operated through humiliation rather than physical pain. Perhaps most alien to modern sensibilities was the lack of specialized juvenile facilities or separate legal procedures for young offenders. Children accused of crimes entered the same courts, faced the same judges, and potentially occupied the same prisons or stocks as adult criminals. This integration exposed young offenders to hardened adult criminals, creating environments where children often learned more sophisticated criminal techniques rather than reformation. Religious institutions sometimes intervened in juvenile cases, offering alternative punishment through monastic discipline or ecclesiastical supervision. Children might be placed in monasteries or convents as a form of correctional custody, particularly for moral or religious offenses. This alternative path could provide education and structure unavailable in secular punishment, though conditions varied dramatically between institutions and abuse remained common. The medieval approach to juvenile justice reveals a society simultaneously harsher and more pragmatic than modern systems. While children could face severe physical punishment or even execution, these outcomes existed within a broader context that recognized children's economic value, the importance of reintegration, and practical limits on institutional capacity. The result was a system that punished children severely by modern standards, while often maintaining more direct paths back to community participation than later, supposedly more humane approaches that segregated juvenile offenders in dedicated institutions for extended periods. The legacy of medieval punishment echoes in modern justice. While modern justice systems appear dramatically different from medieval predecessors, careful examination reveals surprising continuities, transformations, and echoes that connect contemporary practices to their historical roots. The legacy of medieval punishment extends beyond historical curiosity, continuing to shape aspects of how modern societies conceptualize and implement justice. The public nature of medieval punishment has transformed rather than disappeared entirely. While executions now occur behind prison walls with limited witnesses, the media coverage of high-profile cases creates a different form of public spectacle. Televised trials, extensive news coverage, and true crime entertainment continue the tradition of making punishment visible to the broader community, though through technological mediation rather than direct observation. The psychological function remains similar, allowing the public to witness consequences for transgression without participating directly in violence. The stocks and pillory have physical descendants in modern mugshots and sex offender registries, public identification mechanisms that mark individuals as criminals and subject them to community monitoring and potential ostracism. These contemporary practices continue the tradition of making offenders visibly identifiable to the communities they inhabit, though through information rather than physical restraint in public spaces. The essential function of community surveillance remains intact despite technological evolution. Corporal punishment, while largely eliminated from Western judicial systems, persists in school discipline, parental practices, and formal justice systems in various countries worldwide. The philosophical justifications offered often mirror medieval arguments about physical correction, creating necessary deterrence and moral improvement. The gradual restriction of corporal punishment in modern jurisdictions represents one of the clearest breaks with medieval practice, though its persistence in many regions demonstrates the enduring appeal of physical consequences for transgression. Incarceration has evolved from temporary detention before other punishments to become the central feature of modern justice systems, yet carries multiple medieval inheritances. Prison architecture still employs features developed in medieval castles and monasteries, controlled sightlines, centralized surveillance points, and restricted movement paths. The basic concept of removing offenders from society rather than working toward reintegration within community contexts continues medieval practices of exclusion and separation. Class disparities in judicial outcomes, though less explicit than medieval distinctions, continue to shape modern justice. Wealthy defendants' access to superior legal representation, ability to post bail, and advantages in pleading procedures creates de facto different systems for different social classes. While no modern Western court explicitly assigns different punishments based on social rank, the practical outcomes often mirror medieval disparities where higher status offenders receive less severe consequences for equivalent crimes. The concept of proportionality between crime and punishment, matching the severity of consequences to the seriousness of the offense, originated in medieval legal philosophy and remains fundamental to modern justice. The specific calibrations have changed dramatically, but the underlying principle that punishment should correspond to the gravity of the crime connects medieval and contemporary approaches to judicial fairness, despite other significant differences. Even specific punishments show lines of descent from medieval practices. Community service requirements evolved from public labor punishments. Fines and monetary penalties continue the medieval practice of allowing certain offenders to pay instead of suffering physical consequences. Electronic monitoring anklets function as technological versions of medieval movement restrictions. Restitution requirements to victims maintain the concept that offenders should directly compensate those they've harmed. The rehabilitative ideal in modern corrections, that punishment should reform rather than merely penalize, has roots in medieval monastic approaches to discipline that emphasized spiritual transformation through penitential practices. The belief that confinement might lead to personal change and improvement began with religious institutions managing wrongdoers through structured reflection, work, and spiritual guidance before entering secular justice systems. Public shaming, a central feature of medieval punishment, has found new expression through social media and internet platforms. online cancellation, viral videos of wrongdoing, and digital pillories, where individuals face mass criticism for transgressions, create psychological experiences remarkably similar to historical public humiliation, though without state sanction or physical constraint. The human impulse to enforce norms through collective disapproval persists despite technological transformation. Legal terminology preserves direct linguistic connections to medieval justice. Terms like witness stand, bar of justice, and defendant all originated in medieval court procedures and physical arrangements. Even trial itself comes from medieval concepts of trying or testing the accused through ordeal or examination. This linguistic persistence represents more than mere terminology. It reflects conceptual continuities in how justice is imagined and structured. The retributive aspect of punishment, that offenders deserve to suffer in proportion to the suffering they've caused, maintains remarkable continuity from medieval to modern times. While methods have become less physically brutal, the underlying principle that justice requires wrongdoers to experience negative consequences proportional to their crimes remains central to most justice systems and public expectations about appropriate sentencing. Perhaps most significantly, the fundamental tension between mercy and justice that characterized medieval approaches continues to animate contemporary debates about criminal justice reform. Medieval judges navigated between strict application of often harsh legal codes and discretionary mercy based on individual circumstances. The same essential balance modern systems attempt to strike through sentencing guidelines, judicial discretion, and clemency mechanisms. The transition away from spectacle punishment toward private confinement represents not just humanization, but also changing power dynamics. Michel Foucault's analysis suggests this shift demonstrates evolving techniques of control, from dramatic displays of sovereign power over bodies to more pervasive, consistent discipline of minds and behaviors through surveillance and regimentation. Modern prison systems may be less overtly cruel than medieval executions, but potentially more totalizing in their control of individuals. By recognizing these connections between medieval and modern approaches to punishment, we gain perspective on how deeply historical practices inform contemporary justice despite apparent discontinuities. The medieval legacy persists not just in vestigial procedures or terminologies, but in fundamental assumptions about the purpose of punishment, the relationship between offender and community, and the proper response to transgression. This continuity suggests that societies should carefully examine historical antecedents when evaluating or reforming current practices, recognizing that many aspects of modern justice represent evolution rather than complete breaks from approaches developed centuries ago in dramatically different social contexts. The medieval gallows, anatomy of an execution site. The gallows, perhaps the most iconic symbol of medieval justice, was far more than a simple wooden structure for hanging criminals. It represented a complex physical and symbolic space where judicial authority, religious meaning, community participation, and the transformation of living person to cautionary corpse all intersected. Understanding the medieval gallows as a multidimensional site reveals how execution locations served purposes far beyond the mechanical implementation of death sentences. The physical architecture of permanent gallows evolved considerably throughout the medieval period. Early versions were often simple wooden frames, sometimes little more than a sturdy branch or beam supported by posts. By the later medieval period, more elaborate structures emerged, multi-person gallows with stone foundations, dedicated platforms, and sometimes integrated space for officials, religious representatives, and even premium spectator positions. These permanent structures marked the landscape as dedicated spaces of death, visibly asserting the presence of judicial authority, even when not actively in use. Location carried tremendous symbolic significance. Gallows were typically positioned at significant boundaries, city limits, crossroads, parish borders, or jurisdictional boundaries. This liminal placement reinforced the concept that execution represented both literal and symbolic expulsion from the community. Some locations became so associated with death that they formed part of local geography and language. Names like Gallows Hill, Gibbet Heath, or Tyburn, London's famous execution site, permanently marked landscapes with their judicial purpose. The gallows site functioned as more than merely the location of death. Medieval executions typically included multiple stations where different aspects of punishment occurred. The condemned might be tortured at one location, formally sentenced at another, publicly displayed through town en route to the gallows, executed at the primary site, and their remains displayed at yet another location. This procession created a geography of punishment extending throughout the community rather than concentrated at a single point. Technical considerations shaped gallows design and use. The short drop method, common in medieval hanging, required specific structural features: a platform or cart that could be removed from beneath the condemned's feet, a crossbeam strong enough to support a struggling body's weight, and sufficient height to prevent bystander interference. Unlike later long drop methods designed to break the neck instantly, medieval hanging utilized slow strangulation, with the victim's height carefully calibrated to prolong the process while keeping feet inaccessible to mercy-minded relatives who might pull downward to hasten death. Crowd management influenced physical arrangements around gallows sites. Popular executions could draw thousands of spectators, creating requirements for visibility, crowd control, and sometimes protection of the condemned until the official execution moment. Some permanent gallows included barriers keeping crowds at specified distances, designated areas for officials and clergy, and sight lines engineered to ensure maximum visibility from surrounding natural amphitheaters where spectators gathered. The gallows served as more than execution site. It also functioned as display location. Bodies might remain hanging for days, weeks, or even months as warnings to others. This extended function required specific design elements like metal cages, gibbet cages, to contain decomposing remains, chains rather than ropes for long-term display, and occasionally preservative treatments like tar or oil to slow decomposition and maximize the warning period before natural processes reduce the body to a skeleton. Religious elements were physically incorporated into many gallows sites. A small area might be designated for clergy to stand during final rites. Some locations included prayer stations where the condemned would pause for final devotions before ascending the steps. Crosses or other religious symbols sometimes formed part of the permanent structure, emphasizing the spiritual dimensions of execution and offering the condemned final opportunities for divine mercy, even as human justice showed none. The soil beneath permanent gallows acquired special significance through association with death. Gallows earth was collected for use in folk magic practices, believed to hold power through its absorption of the dying energy of countless executed criminals. Similarly, pieces of the gallows wood, rope used in hangings, or personal effects of the executed were collected as talismans, creating a secondary economy of magical objects derived from the execution site. The gallows ground often doubled as burial location for the executed, who were frequently denied burial in consecrated church grounds. These criminal cemeteries accumulated over time, creating literal underworlds beneath execution sites. Archaeological excavations of such locations reveal how bodies were treated differently from normal burials, often interred hastily in unusual positions, sometimes with evidence of post-mortem examination or dismemberment, and occasionally with objects associated with superstitious practices intended to prevent spiritual return. Weather conditions at exposed gallows sites added an additional dimension of suffering often overlooked in accounts focused on the execution itself. Positioned typically at elevated or exposed locations for maximum visibility, gallows subjected the condemned to environmental extremes: bitter cold, driving rain, or merciless sun depending on season. This environmental suffering formed an often unrecorded additional punishment preceding the execution itself, as condemned prisoners might wait hours in extreme conditions before their sentence was carried out. Maintenance of gallows created a specialized role in medieval communities. The structures required regular repair and upkeep, creating the somewhat macabre occupation of gallows maintainer, someone responsible for ensuring the proper functioning of this deadly infrastructure. Records show payments for gallows repair, replacement of worn ropes or chains, and structural reinforcement when multiple executions were planned, demonstrating the institutional commitment to maintaining these physical manifestations of judicial power. The acoustic dimension of gallows sites formed part of their power. Positioned often on hills or open areas, the sounds of execution, the condemned's final words, the executioner's proclamations, the collective reaction of the crowd, and most disturbing, the sounds of struggling and death, could carry across significant distances. This acoustic reach extended the impact beyond just those physically present, as the distinctive sounds of judicial death traveled into communities and homes, making execution an auditory as well as visual experience for a wider population. Control of the gallows represented an important aspect of judicial authority. The right to erect and use gallows, known as the right of pit and gallows, or furca et fossa, was jealously guarded by those authorities granted execution privileges. Physical possession of execution infrastructure symbolized and concretized the power of high justice, the authority to impose capital punishment. Disputes over which nobles, towns, or ecclesiastical authorities possessed gallows rights feature prominently in medieval legal records, demonstrating how important these physical structures were to the performance and maintenance of power. By examining the gallows as a complex physical, symbolic, and social space, rather than merely a technological means of execution, we gain deeper insight into how medieval communities organized the implementation of ultimate punishment. The gallows stood as constant reminder of authority's reach, a teaching tool for proper behavior, a stage for the final public transformation of criminal to corpse, and a boundary marker between the community of the living and those expelled through ultimate punishment. Its persistent presence in the landscape ensured that judicial violence remained visibly embedded in daily experience, a constant reminder of consequences even when not actively employed in its deadly purpose. Sanctuary and exile, medieval alternatives to execution. Medieval justice, for all its brutality, incorporated several significant alternatives to execution that modern systems have largely abandoned. Chief among these were sanctuary and exile, practices that offered pathways to avoid death penalties without completely undermining judicial authority. These alternatives reveal a medieval approach to justice more nuanced than commonly portrayed, balancing retribution with practical considerations about community well-being and religious values. Sanctuary represented one of the most distinctive features of medieval justice, a practice allowing fugitives to claim temporary protection from arrest or punishment by entering churches or other designated sacred spaces. This right, recognized in both religious and secular law throughout medieval Europe, created literal zones where ordinary judicial authority suspended in deference to divine protection. When a suspected criminal reached a sanctuary site, most commonly a church, but sometimes monasteries, shrines, or other religious locations, pursuers were legally obligated to halt at the threshold. The physical architecture of sanctuary reflected its importance in medieval justice. Many churches included specific sanctuary knockers or rings on their doors that fugitives would grasp to claim protection. Once inside, some churches maintained designated sanctuary seats or stones where claimants would sit to formally establish their protected status. These physical elements created visible reminders of the church's power to temporarily interrupt secular judicial processes. Sanctuary wasn't unlimited, however. Most jurisdictions limited protection to 40 days, symbolically mirroring Christ's 40 days in the wilderness, during which time several outcomes might unfold. Church officials, secular authorities, and the fugitive might negotiate a reduced punishment or compensation arrangement. The accusation might be investigated further, sometimes leading to dropped charges. Or, most commonly in serious cases, the fugitive would face a critical choice at the end of the sanctuary period: surrender to authorities and face trial, or abjure the realm. Abjuration of the realm constituted a fascinating alternative punishment that replaced execution with permanent exile. Those who chose this path would confess their crimes, regardless of actual guilt, surrender their property, and swear an oath to leave the kingdom forever. This created a form of civil death while preserving biological life. The abjurer would be assigned a specific port and timeline for departure, given a wooden cross to carry as identification of their status, and forbidden from deviating from the direct route to their exit point. The journey of abjuration carried its own perilous ritual elements. Abjurers traveled on publicly designated routes, required to keep to major roads and remain visible. They could not stay more than one night in any location. The wooden cross they carried marked them as simultaneously under protection and banished. Others were forbidden from harming them, but equally forbidden from offering substantial assistance beyond basic necessities. This liminal status, as neither fully condemned nor forgiven, created a ritualized transition from community member to permanent outsider. For those who reached their assigned port successfully, what followed was essentially a one-way journey into the unknown. Records rarely followed abjurers beyond their departure, but the challenges they faced were substantial. Arriving in foreign lands without resources, unable to return to their home country on pain of summary execution, and carrying the stigma of criminal status, created precarious circumstances that likely led many to early deaths, despite escaping formal execution. The sanctuary and abjuration system served multiple practical functions beyond mercy. It provided cooling-off periods for crimes committed in passion or where community sentiment might otherwise lead to immediate lynching. It created escape valves for cases where evidence was questionable or circumstances suggested punishment might be excessive. It also acknowledged religious values concerning the sanctity of life while still removing dangerous individuals from the community. Not all who claimed sanctuary chose abjuration. Some surrendered after the protection period, hoping the delay had allowed passions to cool or new evidence to emerge. Others used the time to gather resources for their legal defense or negotiate reduced charges. Some simply hoped for divine intervention during the sanctuary period, a not entirely irrational expectation in a world where religious miracles were considered regular occurrences. Sanctuary rights weren't available equally to all criminals. Certain offenses, particularly treason and sacrilege, were often excluded from sanctuary protection. Repeat offenders might be denied protection, as might those who had previously claimed and violated sanctuary. Social status affected access and practice, if not in formal law. Well-connected individuals often received more extensive protection and better negotiated outcomes during sanctuary periods than common criminals. The Church's motivation for maintaining sanctuary rights was complex. Beyond humanitarian concerns, sanctuary demonstrated ecclesiastical power by physically interrupting secular judicial processes. It created opportunities for spiritual counsel and confession from those who might otherwise die unrepentant. It also generated income, as many sanctuaries required fees from those claiming protection. This multi-layered motivation helped the practice persist, despite periodic attempts by secular authorities to limit or abolish sanctuary rights. Beyond formal sanctuary and abjuration, medieval justice employed other forms of exile as alternatives to execution. Banishment from a specific town or region created an intermediate punishment that removed offenders without killing them. Unlike abjuration, which implied permanent departure from the entire kingdom, banishment might be temporary or limited to specific jurisdictions. This created a graduated system of exclusion depending on crime severity and local circumstances. Communities of exiles sometimes formed in border regions or less governed areas, creating concentrations of banished individuals who established alternative societies on the margins. These outlaw communities developed their own governance systems and economic practices, sometimes raiding their former communities and sometimes establishing more symbiotic relationships through smuggling or providing services unwelcome within city walls. The practical challenges of policing borders meant that banishment often created new problems, even as it solved others. For certain categories of offenders, religious exile offered another alternative to execution. Pilgrimage sentences required criminals to undertake journeys to specific distant shrines as penance for their offenses. These judicial pilgrimages differed from voluntary devotional travel. They typically required proof of completion, included specific penitential practices along the route, and sometimes incorporated permanent relocation at the destination. This practice combined punishment, rehabilitation, and religious devotion, while effectively removing problematic individuals from their communities. The gradual decline of sanctuary and judicial exile corresponded with the rise of state power and institutional incarceration in later medieval and early modern periods. As centralized governments consolidated authority, they increasingly restricted church-based interruptions of judicial processes. The development of prisons as primary punishment locations rather than temporary holding facilities created new alternatives for removing dangerous individuals without execution, making exile less necessary as a non-capital option. By examining these alternatives to execution, we see a medieval justice system employing more varied approaches than the stereotypical image of universal harsh punishment suggests. Sanctuary and exile created spaces where mercy, practical considerations, religious values, and judicial authority negotiated outcomes beyond the binary of freedom or death. These alternatives acknowledged both the value of human life and the need for community protection through mechanisms that modern justice systems, despite their supposedly more humane orientation, have largely abandoned in favor of institutional incarceration as the primary alternative to execution. The executioner, medieval society's necessary outcast. The medieval executioner occupied one of history's most paradoxical social positions, simultaneously essential to justice, yet morally contaminated by its implementation. Technically authorized, yet personally stigmatized, publicly visible, yet socially isolated. Understanding the executioner's complex status illuminates broader medieval conceptions about the necessary but troubling relationship between legitimate authority and sanctioned violence. Recruitment for this disturbing profession followed several patterns, none particularly voluntary in the modern sense. Some executioners were themselves condemned criminals offered commutation of their own death sentences in exchange for taking on the role. Others were family members of previous executioners, inheriting the position through bloodlines when no one else would accept it. In some jurisdictions, the role fell to the youngest journeymen in butchers' guilds, creating a professional connection between animal slaughter and human execution that reinforced the debasing nature of both occupations. The executioner's technical expertise extended far beyond simply killing condemned prisoners. These professionals developed specialized knowledge of anatomy, restraint techniques, and the practical implementation of judicial torture. A skilled executioner knew precisely how to break limbs without causing immediate death, apply thumb screws to maximum pain effect without rendering hands permanently useless, or position burning coals to cause intense suffering while minimizing visible disfigurement if the victim was to be publicly displayed afterward. For capital punishment, technical variation was considerable. A beheading executioner required completely different skills than a hanging specialist. The former needed precise anatomical knowledge to locate the space between vertebrae for clean decapitation, mastery of weapon weight and balance for accurate strikes, and the ability to maintain composure despite blood spray and audience reactions. Hanging executioners, conversely, developed expertise in knot construction, drop distance calculations in later periods, and managing the struggling victim's final moments for proper death performance. Payment structures for executioners varied widely across regions and periods, creating diverse economic relationships between these death specialists and the communities they served. Some received regular salaries as municipal employees, while others worked on a per-execution basis. Many supplemented their official income through sales of execution-adjacent products, pieces of the hanging rope, clothing from the deceased, or even body parts believed to hold healing or magical properties. These economic arrangements reinforced the executioner's ambiguous status. Officially compensated, yet often engaging in macabre side businesses, community members simultaneously condemned and patronized. The executioner's living conditions reflected their paradoxical social position. In many regions, they were required to live outside city walls or in designated areas, separated from respectable neighborhoods. Their homes were sometimes marked with distinctive symbols, red doors, display of execution implements, or specific decorative elements, simultaneously warning others of the occupant's identity and advertising their official function. Despite this segregation, executioners often received certain privileges offsetting their social isolation, such as tax exemptions, rights to collect certain fees, or immunity from particular regulations affecting other citizens. Sumptuary restrictions often applied specifically to executioners, requiring them to wear distinctive clothing that visibly marked their profession. Red clothing predominated in many regions, creating immediate visual identification and symbolic connection to the blood they professionally shed. Gloves held particular significance, with executioners often required to wear them in public, partly as protection for others against the supposed contamination of their touch, and partly as symbol of their authorization to lay hands on condemned bodies when others could not. The executioner's family shared their stigmatized status, creating generational isolation that further encouraged professional continuity through bloodlines. Executioners' children faced limited marriage prospects, educational restrictions, and social exclusion, regardless of their personal involvement in their parents' profession. This collective punishment reinforced the conception that the executioner's work created not just professional, but metaphysical contamination, transferable to those in close association. Religious practices surrounding executioners reveal profound ambivalence about their role. While officially performing necessary functions for authorities, their direct involvement in killing placed them in spiritually questionable territory. Many executioners developed elaborate personal religious rituals to protect themselves from supposed spiritual contamination or the vengeful ghosts of those they executed. Before performing their duties, some would ask forgiveness from the condemned, a practice that acknowledged the moral complexity of their position while fulfilling practical needs for the condemned's cooperation. Beyond their judicial duties, executioners often served additional death-adjacent roles within medieval communities. Many doubled as animal slaughterers, knackers processing dead animals, or disposers of suicide victims' bodies. Some provided medical services, particularly bone setting, wound treatment, or other procedures requiring anatomical knowledge and comfort with causing necessary pain. A significant number performed the role of public torturer distinct from execution duties, cultivating separate expertise for non-lethal judicial pain infliction under official authorization. The executioner's specialized knowledge created surprising demand for their services beyond official judicial contexts. Their anatomical expertise led some to function as unofficial healers, particularly for conditions requiring surgical intervention. Court records show executioners sometimes practiced unauthorized medicine, leveraging their familiarity with human anatomy, despite lacking formal medical training. Similarly, their knowledge of restraint techniques and pain application created occasional demand for their services in extrajudicial contexts, leading to prosecutions for torture for hire outside official authorization. The psychological burden of the executioner's role receives little attention in historical records, but what evidence exists suggests significant impacts. High rates of alcoholism appear in references to executioners across various regions. Some records mention executioners who became unable to continue their duties after particularly troubling executions, especially those involving women or children. Others document executioners who developed elaborate rituals or psychological compartmentalization to manage their participation in sanctioned killing while maintaining some sense of moral integrity. Despite their social marginalization, executioners occasionally achieved notoriety, approaching celebrity status. Particularly skilled practitioners became known for their humane efficiency, a clean beheading in one stroke, or a knot that ensured quicker death by hanging. Some gained reputations for granting small mercies to the condemned, such as providing strong drink before execution or adjusting their technique to minimize suffering beyond official requirements. These professional reputations created a strange form of social capital within an otherwise stigmatized occupation. The executioner's mask, when worn, served multiple functions beyond simple disguise. While protecting specific identity, it also transformed the individual into a symbolic embodiment of judicial authority. The masked executioner acted not as a person, but as the physical manifestation of the state's power over life and death. This depersonalization benefited both the community, allowing members to separate the individual from their function, and the executioner, creating psychological distance between their everyday identity and their professional role. As centralized justice systems evolved in later medieval periods, the executioner's institutional position gradually formalized. Some regions developed hereditary executioner families, who maintained virtual monopolies over implementation of judicial violence across generations. These dynasties accumulated specialized knowledge and techniques passed from father to son, creating lineages of death specialists whose family histories intertwined with the development of punishment technologies and practices across centuries. The executioner thus existed at a unique intersection of necessity and rejection, embodying the uncomfortable truth that even the most civilized medieval societies required individuals willing to perform sanctioned violence too disturbing for ordinary citizens to implement or witness directly. By designating specific individuals to bear this burden and then isolating them for their participation, medieval communities maintained the fiction of collective moral cleanliness while still accessing the deterrent and retributive benefits of judicial violence. This paradoxical position, essential yet excluded, made the executioner one of medieval society's most complex and revealing professional roles, illuminating fundamental contradictions in how communities balance needs for both justice and moral self-conception. The medieval body as judicial canvas, punishment written on flesh. Medieval justice transformed the human body into a legible text where punishment was not merely applied to, but written permanently upon the flesh. This practice of marking criminals created a walking judicial record that communicated criminal history, judicial power, and social warning through physical alterations that accompanied offenders throughout their remaining lives. Branding represented perhaps the most direct method of marking criminal bodies. Using heated metal implements, authorities permanently branded specific letters or symbols into the skin of convicted criminals. These marks functioned as a permanent, non-removable criminal record visible to all. The location of branding carried specific meaning: the face for the most serious or repeated offenses, the hand for those given partial mercy, and concealed body areas for those granted greater clemency. Common branding marks included T for theft, F for felon, V for vagrant, B for blasphemy, or M for murder, creating a standardized system of bodily annotation that any medieval observer could immediately interpret. Mutilation served both punitive and identificatory functions. The removal of ears, slitting of nostrils, or cutting of lips for certain crimes ensured that former offenders carried unmistakable signs of their criminal history. These disfigurements functioned as a kind of public safety system, warning potential victims, employers, or associates about an individual's past behavior through immediately visible physical alteration. Unlike branding, which required standardized interpretation, missing body parts created intuitive, non-verbal communication about criminal status, requiring no literacy or specialized knowledge to comprehend. The removal or destruction of body parts directly connected to specific crimes created a form of poetic justice written on the body itself. Pickpockets lost hands, forgers lost fingers, used to create false documents. Blasphemers had their tongues partially removed, and sexual offenders might be castrated. This punishment fits the crime approach, created visible cause and effect relationships between specific transgressions and their physical consequences, reinforcing social norms through embodied examples. Distinctive forced appearance modifications marked certain offenders. Women convicted of adultery or prostitution might have their hair forcibly cut short or be required to wear specific head coverings that marked their sexual transgressions. Male offenders in some jurisdictions had their beards partially shaved in distinctive patterns indicating their crimes. These appearance-based punishments leveraged medieval social importance attached to hair as markers of gender, status, and respectability. Judicial scarification, deliberate creation of distinctive scar patterns, offered another method of marking criminal bodies. Unlike chaotic scarring from whipping or other punishments, judicial scarification created specific patterns: crosses, circles, parallel lines, in visible locations that identified not just criminal status, but sometimes specific crimes or jurisdictions where offenses occurred. These intentional scar patterns transformed healing itself into the creation of permanent judicial records. The physical effects of judicial punishment created unintentional but equally effective bodily marking. Repeated flogging left distinctive scarring patterns across backs and shoulders. Survivors of judicial torture carried twisted joints, malformed bones, and characteristic movement limitations resulting from strappado, rack, or other devices. These inadvertent markings functionally identified former offenders as effectively as intentional branding or mutilation, creating bodily records of judicial intervention. Clothing and accessory-based marking extended the concept of the marked body through required wearing of specific identifiers. Certain offenders were sentenced to permanently wear distinctive colors, symbols, or specific garment types marking their criminal status. Though theoretically removable, attempting to appear in public without these required markers constituted a separate offense with severe penalties. This practice extended the concept of judicial marking beyond the skin to create a larger, more visible bodily text. The cumulative effect of these practices created a society where criminal history was publicly visible rather than privately recorded. Unlike modern criminal records, accessible only to authorities through databases, medieval criminal marking made judicial history part of everyday public knowledge through physical alterations visible in ordinary social interactions. This visibility transformed punishment from a discrete event to a continuous experience extending throughout the marked individual's lifetime. For those marked by judicial intervention, economic and social consequences often proved more devastating than the initial physical pain. Distinctive criminal markings severely limited employment opportunities, marriage prospects, guild membership, and community integration. The marked body became a continuous impediment to rehabilitation or social reintegration, effectively extending punishment indefinitely through socioeconomic exclusion, justified by visible bodily alterations. Perhaps most significantly, the marked criminal body served as mobile judicial advertising, continuous public reminders of authorities' reach and consequences for transgression. Each branded forehead, missing ear, or distinctive scar pattern encountered in daily life reinforced the omnipresence of judicial power without requiring additional resources or institutional structures. Former offenders unwillingly became walking deterrents, whose very existence communicated judicial messages through their altered flesh. The medieval practice of marking criminal bodies thus represents more than merely primitive punishment. It constituted a sophisticated system of public information, deterrence, and social control, operating through the transformation of human flesh into permanent judicial record. By inscribing punishment directly onto bodies, rather than merely applying it temporarily, medieval justice ensured that each sentence extended far beyond its immediate administration, creating enduring physical texts that continued communicating judicial messages throughout the marked individual's remaining lifetime. Among the most bizarre aspects of medieval justice was the formal prosecution and punishment of animals for criminal acts. These proceedings, conducted with the same procedural seriousness as human trials, reveal medieval conceptions of justice that extended far beyond human boundaries into a comprehensive moral universe where all creatures were subject to legal accountability. The most thoroughly documented animal defendants were pigs, likely due to their ubiquity in medieval settlements and tendency to cause harm when inadequately contained. Court records detail trials of pigs that had injured or killed human children, with these animals arrested, imprisoned, tried with formal legal representation, and if convicted, executed with the same ceremonial elements as human criminals. In 1386, a sow in Falaise, France was convicted of infanticide, dressed in human clothing, and publicly executed in the town square by an official executioner. Her body then hung on public display as warning to other pigs. Insects and rodents faced collective prosecution when they damaged crops or property. Rather than individual arrest, these creatures received summons as entire species, with court-appointed defenders arguing on their behalf against prosecutors representing the affected human communities. These trials often incorporated complex theological and legal arguments about animals' right to God's creation versus human agricultural claims. In a notable 1545 case from France, a defense attorney for vineyard-destroying weevils successfully argued that as God's creatures, they had divine right to feed themselves, resulting in the town being required to set aside specific vineyard portions for the insects' exclusive use. The proceedings followed established judicial procedures with remarkable fidelity. Animals received legal representation from actual court-appointed attorneys who raised legitimate defenses, presented evidence, and even filed appeals. Courts issued formal summons to animal defendants, allowed appropriate time for their appearance, and followed standard rules of evidence and testimony. Judges rendered verdicts with full formal language, and sentences were carried out by official executioners or court officers, maintaining all procedural elements used in human trials. Theological complexity surrounded animal prosecutions. Christian doctrine held that animals lacked souls and moral agency, yet the practice of trying them implied sufficient responsibility to face consequences for harmful actions. This contradiction required elaborate justifications from medieval legal theorists and theologians, who developed frameworks explaining how creatures without moral understanding could nevertheless be subject to human justice as part of the divine order that placed humans in dominion over animals. The punishments themselves reflected serious judicial intent rather than mere symbolic performance. Large animals convicted of harming humans typically faced execution by hanging, burning, or other methods used for human offenders. Court records detail expenses for animal imprisonment, transportation to execution sites, and payment to executioners, demonstrating institutional commitment to these proceedings. Some animals even received partial punishments mirroring human sentences, such as amputation of limbs before execution for particularly heinous offenses. Beyond direct physical harm, animals could be prosecuted for symbolic offenses against human moral or religious order. Roosters were tried for the supernatural crime of laying eggs, believed to be physically impossible without demonic intervention, and these cock eggs were thought to hatch basilisks or be used in witchcraft. Animals that engaged in sexual behavior, considered deviant or participated unwillingly in human bestiality, faced trial and execution for crimes against nature, with theological justifications explaining why the animal required death despite lacking moral comprehension. The geographic and temporal distribution of animal trials reveals patterns of cultural anxiety. Cases clustered during periods of social upheaval, religious conflict, or natural disaster, suggesting these proceedings functioned partly as displacement activities, allowing communities to reassert control symbolically when facing broader uncertainties. The types of animals prosecuted shifted over time, with dangerous wild animals predominating in earlier periods and domestic animals, or insects, featuring more prominently in later medieval and early modern cases. Behind these seemingly irrational proceedings lay a coherent, if alien, worldview, where justice was not merely a human social contract, but a cosmic principle extending throughout creation. Animals, while lacking human reason, still participated in a universal moral order, requiring accountability for disruptive actions. These trials affirmed human authority within this divine framework, while simultaneously acknowledging non-human creatures as legitimate, if lesser, participants in a shared moral universe rather than mere objects or property. The tradition of animal trials persisted with remarkable longevity, continuing well into the early modern period, despite growing intellectual challenges to their legitimacy. The last formal animal execution in Europe occurred in 1906 in Switzerland, when a dog was officially executed for murder, demonstrating how deeply rooted these concepts remained, even as modernity otherwise transformed legal thinking. This surprising persistence reveals how thoroughly medieval conceptions of universal justice embedded themselves in Western legal imagination, creating practices bizarre to modern sensibilities, yet perfectly coherent within their original cosmological framework.